been involved in the Jewish Socialist group since the early 1980s, and one of my prime involvements with the Jewish Socialist group is to produce our magazine. The group didn't have a publication when I joined, it just had some bits of paper. I'm a journalist by background, but my political background at that point was in campaigning, grassroots journalism, and I convinced the group that we could teach people who wanted to learn writing and editorial and production skills, and that's what we did. So our magazine started in 1985 and is still going. So that's my practical involvement in the group.
Yeah, I joined the group in my first year at university, which was a long time ago in 1976. And I'd kind of heard about it a bit by accident. I was at Leeds University. I went over to spend a weekend with some friends at Manchester University. I was at a party, got talking to a young woman who had the same badge as me, which was Chile Fights. I mean, this is, just shortly after the coup in Chile. And we got talking about various things, including Jewish and socialist-y type things. And she says, oh, you should speak to my mum. She's in the Jewish Socialist group. And so, and at that time, the centre of the Jewish Socialist group was Manchester and Liverpool in the north of England. But I did make contact with them. I went over to a couple of meetings. And at that time, I had a number of friends at different universities around Britain, and we kind of joined as a group, joined the Jewish Socialist group. And within a year or two, we were able to establish at least a temporary London branch based on the students who were there in between term times. And that's how it got going. And at that time, anti-racism and anti-fascism were very strong themes of the group. The National Front fascists were very active, as was the resistance to that. And there was also a kind of concern that discussion of Israel, Palestine, the whole region and the politics of that it wasn't where the left showed its real sophistication. And we thought we maybe had something to add to that or throw some questions into that. So it wasn't seen as an overall Jewish socialist program, if you like, at that point. It was more that there were Jewish socialists organizing on certain issues. And that got clarified in the early 1980s, and where we adopted increasingly kind of Bundist perspectives.
From what I've heard about the JSG, from which I've heard a little bit because my father was involved in it as well back in those days, I remember hearing that it didn't start off as a Bundist group or one that was necessarily connected to the Bund. It started off in Manchester, as you said, but also more connected to Jewish communists. Can you tell us a little bit about that process of the organizing?
Yeah, I mean, the initial people I went to some meetings in Manchester shortly after I'd sort of found out about the group. And it was mainly people who were either in the Communist Party or had been in the Communist Party, and some people who were in the Labour Party. In terms of Zionism and anti-Zionism and non-Zionism, you had some people who would consider themselves left-wing Zionists within it, but who had no intention of leaving Britain to go and live in Israel, but felt sympathetic to left-wing Zionism. You had others that would define themselves in more sort of non-Zionist terms. And over the next couple of years, you had others coming in who were more happy to call themselves anti-Zionists. But we kind of recognized our common ground on the things that we wanted to move forward about, to mobilize more Jewish people in anti-racist and anti-fascist work, to get more sophisticated debate on Israel-Palestine issues and shift opinion, both within the left and within Jewish communities. So we were able to work on that, but more and more in that period, late 70s, early 80s, we kind of felt a need to define ourselves with a more holistic ideology. And that's where I have to say Zach's dad was quite influential in the group, and he was around a group in Cambridge of people that came in and shared some of those perspectives, and actually it became the kind of common sense approach of the group, because it really did speak to our common sense. Quite a number of us, and Julia can tell you this, but had been involved with Zionist youth movements at some point, Julia more so than me, but we changed our perspectives, but we're looking for some way to clarify exactly what our identity was.
Yeah, I mean, the point at which I came into the group was the point at which that shift, I suppose, was happening between a group of disparate people from disparate backgrounds who shared some common ground towards a group that had a much more coherent and incipient diasporist politics, which asserted the right and the normality of Jewish life in the diaspora, wherever Jews lived. And for me, that was crucial when I came into the group, because I was very involved in a socialist Zionist youth movement when I was in my teens. And the impact of that has stayed with me most is the socialist bit. The bit that I had a problem with from the moment I went to university was the Zionist bit, and not just because of what was happening to the Palestinians, although obviously that was part of it, and more so when I subsequently went to live in Israel for 2 years. And the attitude of Zionism to the diaspora, the downgrading of it, the undermining of diaspora cultures, the denial of Jewish history in the diaspora, the rewriting of Jewish history and the Jewish experience in the diaspora. And when I came into the Jewish Socialist group, what I found was a group of people who reinforced my experience as a diaspora Jew. My grandparents came from the former Russian Empire and were Yiddish speakers. And I'd always been really interested in that. And I'd had to keep that under wraps because in the Zionist youth movement, it was really, not acceptable to be interested in Yiddish music and Yiddish culture. That was seen as some kind of throwback. And so the chance to be Jewish and secular in the sense not necessarily of being atheist, but of seeing the life of the state as having people of all religions and none as of equal status, and facilitating that, to fight for that, seemed to me to be really kind of crucial. And I would say in that respect, I was also involved in a group called Women Against Fundamentalism, which developed those kind of ideas in a much more sophisticated way and brought that into the Jewish Socialist group. And I think that informs our politics quite profoundly as well.
I think there were a few different developments that happened in the early 80s that really solidified our outlook. In the late 70s, we were very influenced by the anti-racist politics of various Asian political groups who adopted the slogan, "Here to stay, here to fight." And that was a really significant one. It was the opposite of what we were told in Zionist youth movements when we were in Zionist youth movements, here not to stay and here not to fight. But it was saying that it's not just a matter of fighting racism, it's also about forging some kind of future that is really equal in every way if you're a minority. Yeah, that was one thing. Second thing is that in the early 80s, when we were starting to think more about our identity, if you like, and also learning more about the significance of Yiddish for a lot of us and rediscovering that in a way, we also recruited somebody to the group, a guy called Shalom Charikar, who was from an Indian Jewish community, the B'nai Israel community. And his perspective on things was very interesting and very challenging, but it actually blended quite well with the Bundism in lots of ways, and in terms of diasporism and different dimensions of diaspora. And his approach to looking at Zionism was very different to the way a lot of mainstream Jews in the West were looking at it.
Yeah, because it was predicated on an anti-colonialist foundation, which didn't come from here. It came from the Indian subcontinent.
Yeah. And he died in the early 2000s, but was around it a long time. And one of the particular initiatives that he did, which also spread beyond the JSG, was in the late 80s, he founded a group called Jews Against Apartheid, which was about apartheid in South Africa. And that was a very successful initiative. But also two things that happened in around 83, 84 and 85 was there was a change in London politics. The old London County Council became the Greater London Council, and the Greater London Council had been run by the Tories in the late 70s. Suddenly it was run by a very radical, it was run by a Labour administration, and then there was a coup within it by the left to make it a very radical London administration under Ken Livingstone, John McDonnell, people like this, and they turned their funding operation upside down. Instead of being a very paternalistic funding operation among their chosen groups, they basically put it out there that if you are a group of people in London and you've got an initiative that you think would be good for London, write a grant application. And lots of minority groups and activists in minority groups were busy with this, and a lot got grants. And the Jewish Socialist Group was one of them. And we had something called the Jewish Cultural and Anti-Racist Project. It had to be a project focused on London. So it couldn't be, if you like, about our general politics. But that, in a way, forced us to kind of define those better. And a lot of the cultural stuff we did was around Yiddish, developing Yiddish classes. We ran a Yiddish folk song workshop where for a couple of years people learned lots of Yiddish workers' songs and other things, and learned a lot about Yiddish roots, if you like. But also we did a lot of work where we were doing public meetings with joint Jewish and Black platforms in different community areas. And it was a very formative period for the group that really, it made us feel very at home within very wider anti-racist circles among many different communities, and gained quite a lot of respect by people for what we were doing. But this was also in exactly the same period when Thatcher had become the Prime Minister. So you had this radical London council, and just over the water, because they were south of the river in the building County Hall, and over the river was Parliament, dominated by the right, going further and further right. The other moment that was really important would have been around 84, 85. We had started to have some contact with some of the older left-wing Yiddish activists in London, and one of whom was Meyer Bogdansky, a Bundist. And he came to speak to the group about the Bund and his activism. And he was in his 20s in the 1930s in Poland. He came to Britain after the war, 46, lived in the East End the rest of his life. And he gave this talk that was about 40 minutes long, and it was a completely electrifying meeting. You could see the light bulbs going on and people's eyes opening, and, it was like paradigm shifts happening in front of you. And that really helped. What Barry Smerin had done to help in pushing in that direction towards adopting a Bundist approach. Here we had somebody actually who had been active in the Bund in the 30s, still believed very firmly in those same ideas and principles, and was able to explain, what that was about, and just really excite and energize people with it.
Yeah, and also, it wasn't history at all, because he was an activist in London politics, as well as giving us this incredible history and politics from Poland. I just wanted to add something about the GLC period, because what it did was assumed that people living at the grassroots of society in London knew what their own situation was and could identify their own needs. That sounds like just a commonplace thing to say, but actually, and I don't know if the GLC was aware of it when it started out down this path, was that the actuality is that they're not atomized, they're not individuals who know their own situation, they live in groups and communities. And to give resources to people who are at the grassroots of communities, minority communities, is often to put them in conflict with the establishment institutions of their communities. Obviously, that applied to us. We were immediately, we were already at odds with the Board of Deputies, but that really put the tin lid on things for us to get money to define our own situation and act on it and make alliances with other groups. But it also identified for us the fact that we were not alone in the Asian community, as it was then called more accurately than it is now, as Hindu and Muslim and Sikh and by religion. At that time, there were a lot of young Asian activists who were completely at odds with their own community establishments, who wanted to really be in with the government and in with the state. So we found common cause across communities underneath the official institutions of our communities. And that was seen as very, very, very threatening. And we did raise the ire of our communal institutions across the board. They went nuts.